In our Bibles this morning, we're looking at 2 Samuel chapter 15. Maybe you've heard this word. It's mentioned probably a half a dozen times, if not more, in our Old Testament. The brook Kidron. The message this morning is Kidron, when it looks like the end. We have a story in 2 Samuel chapter 15 about a well-known person in the Old Testament, someone who was a type of Christ in the Old Testament. Matter of fact, Jesus' kingdom would come from his lineage and from his heritage, and we know him as King David. Kidron is symbolic of a place that is the end. Now, think about your life this morning. If you've ever got to a place where you thought, this is the end. This is too hard for me to overcome. The pressure's too great. I've messed up too bad. Everybody's against me. Only for you to find out later it was just a temporary stopping place and it wasn't the end. Because here you are. You're still here. David, a man after God's own heart, is one of the examples this morning of someone that had to cross over Kidron. Kidron is not a place to stay at. Kidron is a place we pass through. It's a place we go over. It's not something we can go around your whole life. It has to be gone through. For all David's successes, he was at a place in 2 Samuel chapter 15 where his own son Absalom had stole the hearts of Israel and rebelled against his own father. He didn't just want to be king when it was his time to inherit the kingdom. He wanted it now. And if you read the story about David, you'll see or about Absalom, his son, how he went to the people and buttered them up and said, oh, if I was king, I would do this. He was a great politician. If I was king, I would do this. And I would give everybody a fair rendering. And I would give you this. Insinuating things his father wasn't giving them, he would. And you know what? It worked. He even went after David's counselor and got him on his side. So now David, for all his power, this is the same shepherd boy that God picked and sent the prophet to anoint him. And eventually, his patience with Saul was amazing. After God had taken his spirit from Saul, put it on David and said, you're my next king, he still waited for God to do things in the right order. Well, now he's had some successes, but now he's at a place where he has to run. Ever been there? Ever experienced victory in your life? Things are going well, successes have piled up, only to come to your own personal Kidron brook. That's where David was. Running for his life. He'd been told that Absalom wanted him and his own son wanted to kill him. And he has to run and flee for his life. Verse 12 tells us that Absalom had sent for Ahithophel, the Gibeonite. That was David's counselor. And the people, notice what verse 12 says, and the conspiracy was strong, for the people increasingly continued with Absalom. And there came a messenger unto David, saying, the heart of the men of Israel are after Absalom. David said to all his servants that were with him at Jerusalem, arise, let us flee, for we shall not escape Absalom. Make speed to depart, lest he overtake us suddenly, bring evil upon us, and smite the city with the edge of the sword. And the king's servant said unto the king, behold thy servant, we are ready to do whatsoever my lord the king shall appoint. Skip down with me now to verse 17. And the king went forth, and all the people after him, and tarried in a place that was afar off. And all his servants passed on beside him, all the Cherethites and the Pilathites and the Gittites, 600 men came from Gath, passed before the king. Then the king also went over, and he too passed. He had to cross over. It's called a brook in the Bible. Kidron's called a brook, but it was a body of water. And it was where all the waste went. It was where all the idols, when they had been torn down by some of the good kings, they would break them into powder and throw them into Kidron. It was a burial ground. It was a sewage place. So David, his heart was broken because of Absalom's betrayal. His son wasn't content to be the crown prince. He wanted to be Israel's king, so he led a coup. David would write about this later on in Psalm 41 when he said prophetically, "Even my old familiar friend in whom I trusted, who ate my bread, hath lifted up his heel against me." In order to avoid bloodshed, David was forced to flee. He abdicated his throne, walked across the Kidron Valley with a small group of loyal followers, and made his way up to Mount of Olives, which we'll feature in later, barefoot and crying as he went. What a picture. What happened? This was David, King David, who they had said Saul had killed his thousands, but David had killed his 10,000s. But now he's at a different point in life, and he's having to cross over a place in the Bible that is known for two things. Number one, a burial ground, but then number two, Jeremiah's prophecy says one day God will overturn. That's the verse that's in your bulletins. God will overturn this awful place, and it may very well be the place where the resurrection of the dead happens first. But that's not now. David's barefoot, he's crying, he's just got a few followers with him. Most of the others have forsook him. Have you ever experienced the pain of betrayal? I'll bet everyone has. Our trust has been broken and violated by those close to us. If not, if you are, you're not alone. We've all been there. We've all had to deal with betrayal. It could be a coworker, could be a boss, could be a friend, a parent, in this case a sibling, child, spouse. Betrayal is absolute unfaithfulness and disloyalty. Betrayal is the breaking of an agreement, violation of a friendship. Betrayal is to lead astray, to seduce, to deceive, to abandon. It's to be harmed by the intentional actions of a trusted friend. Can't get any closer than his own son. Amazing when we read this. Betrayal destroys all the foundations of trust because it's a violation of confidence to someone near us. It's learning that someone we thought was with us is actually against us. Someone we've maybe shared the most intimate thoughts in secret with. They know you better than anyone else, and yet they've betrayed you. It affects us mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and physically. It hurts. It creates a deep wound in my soul. Who else experienced a betrayal like David in the New Testament and had to grow over the same ground? You might be surprised this morning to know in John chapter 8, verses 1 through 2, Jesus, on his way to Gethsemane, had to cross over Kidron. It's spelled with a C instead of a K, but it's the same place, that same piece of ground where David had to cross over barefoot and crying. Jesus had to pass over. Why? He'd been betrayed. Judas, his close friend for 3.5 years, numbered with the apostles, same powers the apostles were given over devils, betrayed him for 30 pieces of silver. Jesus, too, had to walk across Kidron. He was betrayed by his closest associate. He joined in the enemy in the evil plot to humiliate and crucify the Lord. He had eaten with Jesus, betrayed him with a kiss of all things. Didn't value the relationship he had with Jesus. He valued the amount of money for her. So this betrayal led to a painful, humiliating death on the cross. But here again, I'll go back to David in a second, this was not the end for Jesus, was it? He overcame, he rose from the dead, and he's coming again. What about David? Well, it got a little worse with David. As he's walking along, and I'll paraphrase, there's a fellow that came out of the town called Shimei. You know what Shimei is known for? Stoning King David. Shimei came out while he was crossing over at his lowest point and began to throw rocks at David and his men. One man began to curse him. Blamed him. It was a relative of King Saul, who referred to as his father. And he blamed David for Saul falling on his own sword rather than being captured. He blamed David, calling him a bloody man. Isn't it funny? Have you ever been low? You ever been at your lowest point and someone else just piles on or something else piles on? Boy, the enemy specializes in that, beloved. The enemy will specialize when you're down to kick you. That's what he does. That's his job. That's what his demons do. They've had 6,000 or 8,000 years to study human beings. They know you. They know me. And they know what it's like to be down. When Jesus was down, we know the terrible treatment he received. David had received it too. Here's a man, a relative of Saul, who comes out of nowhere to add to it. He's barefoot, he's crying, he's fleeing for his life. And this Shimei comes up and starts throwing rocks at him. And dust and dirt and calling him names. Now, David had some faithful soldiers with him. We all know about David's mighty men of valor, but he had some faithful soldiers with him. One of them says to him, David, let me go kill this dead dog. That's what he thought of Shimei. Let me go take his head off with my sword, is the exact quote. Did David strike back? No. Look in chapter 16. Verse 5, verse 6. Shimei began to cast stones at David and his servants, calling him cursed, son of the devil, in verse 7. Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, the king, said to David in verse 9, why should this dead dog curse my lord king? Let me go over and take off his head. It's not like David was defenseless. In much the same way Jesus said to Peter, get behind me, Satan, you savorest not the things of God. David said, what have I to do with you, you sons of Jeruah? Let him curse. Perhaps the Lord hath told him, curse David. He was so disheartened and down on himself that his own son was pursuing him. No doubt he thought about Bathsheba. He thought about his mistakes. He thought about how great he had lived at one time. He was so down on himself, he said, you know what? Maybe the Lord told him to come and curse me. You ever felt like that? Maybe this is God's judgment on me. Let him alone. You just imagine this mighty man thinking, who is this? This is the guy we've been following, the leader, the strong personality, the alpha. And now he says we can't even go do anything to this dead dog that's cursing him, this nobody. Now, don't get me wrong, Shimei, if you read about it, he was a despicable person. He's one of those guys that waited to see which side was going to win in a war, and then they'd be for them. Right, Jim? A lot of groups did that in World War II. Well, I'm going to play my cards right and see, is the Allies going to win, or the Axis powers, or Germany going to win, or I'll wait, and then they jump on the winning side. That's Shimei. He played it all that way his whole life, despicable. And yet David says, don't touch him. God hadn't sent him to curse David. I thought that for a long time until I really studied it out. And in my opinion, that was David's poor view of himself because he was down and almost out. But he says this is just like David. It may be that the Lord will look upon mine affliction and will require me good for his cursing this day. Wow. Beloved, let that sink in. That was hard to say. He had the power to kill this man. And he said, let him be. Maybe God sent him. He was hurt. He was betrayed. But you know what? The Kidron Valley is just a go-between. It's just a place we're not supposed to stay at between Jerusalem and Mount of Olives physically, but it's a place we have to go through. So if you've been there or you're there now, go through it. Don't stay there in the valley of despair, despondency, depression, self-defeat, and don't let any Shimei come out of the woods and tell you you're no good, you're not worth it, God's finished with you. It's a lie. He's not. You're here. You're breathing. You got up this morning. That's good news. God's not finished with you. Amen. And he wasn't finished with David. David wrote in Psalm 23:4, this is another name for Kidron Brook. Though I pass through the valley of the shadow of death, I'll fear no evil. You see, Kidron's not death. Kidron's the shadow of death. And we get scared by shadows sometimes because they appear real to us, but they're not. They're just shadows. Shadows can't hurt us. The shadow of the valley of death can't hurt us. David would write in that psalm, I passed through it, just like he had to pass through Kidron. Just like Jesus had to pass through. In John 18, he says, in being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became as great drops of blood. Anybody ever been so upset and so stressed out you sweat blood? Me either. Doctors now tell us that that's a very real medical condition. I know the name of it, but I can't think of it. Where you're under so much stress that you bleed out of your sweat glands. It mixes with your sweat and you bleed blood because you're so oppressed. So 2,000 years ago, people who discounted Jesus sweating blood rather, God ended up being right. Luke 22:44, Jesus crossed Kidron to go pray in Gethsemane. You know, a lot of times that same ground in the Bible land, different things will happen, though it may be separated by centuries. Here's one of them. In your mind's eye, go back a couple thousand years and see David crossing over that same land. Different buildings, different everything, the same land, running from his son. And now here Jesus is crossing over to be crucified. Same land. So remember, if you're in your Kidron Valley right now, Jesus was there too. He was betrayed. He wasn't out of touch with our reality. He knows what we've been through. He knows our trials, our betrayals. He knows your broken heart. But he also knows that doesn't mean it's over. Kidron doesn't mean it's over when you're there. We got to pass through. It's tough. It's hard. It means we don't have to yield to the bitterness of the betrayer. That's what Jesus did. There's life after the betrayal. The valley of Kidron can be a dark place, but God's there with us. In our darkest night, lowest moments, He's not betrayed us. He's not abandoned us. Amen. We can arise from that slimy pit of betrayal. It's not over. God has plans for our life that's greater than our past. Isn't that good news? I'm so glad He has something better planned for us than our past. We were created to live. We might be in the Kidron Valley sometimes, but walk through it. It's not our destination. It's a transit point that we have to go through. Don't allow betrayal to distract you from your God-given purpose and assignment. God tells us in Psalm 55, He can heal our hurt. He can mend our broken heart. He's bigger than the circumstances. He'll never forsake us. He'll never betray us. Just like David, one of the things we can do, if you've been betrayed, extend forgiveness. Extend forgiveness. It's essential to healing. The pain of betrayal is real, and it may take a while to heal, but if we harbor bitterness and resentment and unforgiveness, nothing good comes of that. Don't stop praying. Guard your heart. Proverbs 4:23, guard your heart. Don't let your heart become bitter. Some people have been to the place of Kidron, the valley, and it got the best of them. They can't leave. They're still stuck there. We've met them in our life many times. Bitter, angry, nothing good to say. Walk into work and they'll right away immediately start telling you everything is wrong with the job they're at, right? Right, Phil? They'll immediately start complaining about the very hand that's feeding them. Well, if I was boss around here, I wouldn't do it that way. Or can you believe this place? And they'll try to get you down. Right, John? In the car business, we used to talk about standing around solving the world's problems. And all we were doing was talking everything down. And if you let yourself, boy, you can get drawn into that. But guard your heart. Refuse to be bitter. Don't let bitterness consume you, and avoid retaliation. Just so you know, David never forgot Shemiel and how he shouldn't have done what he did to God's anointed and God's servant and God's chosen. He did it unjustly. He didn't deserve it. Though David thought so at the time because he's feeling bad about himself, he told Solomon when he was on his deathbed, oh, by the way, you know that fellow Shemiel? If he leaves the Kidron Brook area, kill him. And he did. He did. He went to him and said, you know what you did to my father? Off came his head. In God's time. Because as I said, he was a despicable person. And Solomon got to see that his life was ended. Because what he did was not right. God required justice at the end because he treated David unfairly. So release the anger. Anger is a natural response to betrayal. But it's a dangerous emotion to hold on to. We need to let it go. Don't be too hard on ourselves. Release ourselves from feelings of blame, shame, and guilt. Those do no good. They don't help our life. They don't help us spread the gospel. They don't help our family around us, our friends. Let it go. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I'll fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. We're not alone in the valley. And then last, as I close, the very good news I said in your bulletin and here in Jeremiah 31:40. Remember, Kidron is a place of death. As you're passing through it, you may see death all around you. Raw sewage, to this day, flows from that place. Dead bodies are all around Kidron. It's where they, as I said, tore down idols and ground them up and threw it in the Kidron. Jeremiah 31:4. And the whole valley of dead bodies and of the ashes and all the fields and the brooks of Kidron and the corner of the horse gate toward the east shall be holy unto the Lord, shall not be plucked up, and no thorns down there anymore forever. There's coming a day when God will even change Kidron. Isn't that good news? If he can change a burying ground, a dump, and revive it in the coming day, the scriptures indicate that there'll even be fruit grow from it. He can do the same thing in our life. I don't know what you're facing this morning. I don't know what you're facing this morning watching this at home. But God's not finished yet. Let him have the final say, not discouragement, not despair, not anger. Let God have the final say. Just go through it. Just go through it. That's tough. Tanya, I even thought of a spiritual application to your hometown of Virginia. I think I've mentioned it before, but just as a reminder, the engineers thought it was a good idea when they were building a tunnel. You ever been through a tunnel before on the highway? Well, Virginia engineers had the bright idea, not only would there be a tunnel, because it ran into a mountain, they put it underground the ocean. So if you don't like tunnels, imagine now adding to your dismay by having to go drive underground for a while, knowing there's water around you and the mountain. Well, I was never so happy to come up on the other side of that. I didn't see it coming. My wife's the one that mentioned it to me. She said, honey? I said, yeah. I mean, tunnels, I'm okay with tunnels now. I remember the first time I found it, it was like weird. She goes, honey? That's all I remember her saying. Next thing, down we went. So not only am I trapped in a tunnel, but there's water, thousands of gallons of pressure around me. The Kidron experience feels like that sometimes. You're under pressure. You feel trapped. It's dark. But there's light on the other end. What do we have to do? Stop the car? No. Keep driving. Go through it. Same in our life. If we're having a Kidron experience. That's all. Our Father in heaven, we thank you this morning, Lord, for all that you bring our way. For we know your word teaches us, for your children, you cause all things to work together for the good to those that love you. All things to work for our eternal good. I pray, Father, if someone watching this at a later time, going through an experience like this, that they'll know you are there. Your word tells us you are for us, not against us. Your word tells us you're not willing that any should perish. Any, Father, but you want all to come to repentance. I pray they just keep going through that experience. There's light at the other end. There's joy at the other end. There's happiness at the other end. Don't let them stay there in that experience. Thank you so much, Lord, that we have been through many times in the valley, the shadow of death, but we've gone through it with your help. Sometimes, Father, you have had to carry us, and we praise you this morning for that. You've carried us when we couldn't walk anymore. And we thank you for that. We praise you this morning. And we pray everyone would come to know you as the true God, the true Lord, the true Savior, and accept your Son Jesus and vow to follow him, as invite you into their life and then follow you the rest of their life, all the way to eternity, when your word says his servant shall serve him for all eternity. We love you this morning and praise you in Jesus' precious name. Amen.